Hello and welcome to Transformations Café, where we're serving light as bold as love. I'm your host, Ken Marks. Transformations Café is brought to you by the Institute for Global Transformation. We're a nonprofit, all volunteer organization. Our vision is a world working together to utilize the power, love, and wisdom of higher consciousness to benefit humanity and the planet. Our mission is to support transformations in consciousness and in the way humanity interacts with one another so as to bring about positive change in the world individually and collectively. Please visit our website. It's theglobaltransformation.org, all one word before the .org, the Global Transformation. If you'd like to join our community, there's a join button at the top of each page on the site that will give more detail on both our paid and free membership options. And if you'd like to support our work, including programs like this one, there's a donate button at the top of each page that takes you straight through to PayPal. This program is being recorded, as they used to say, in front of a live audience, and will be published on IFGT's YouTube channel. So for those of you joining us live, please note that if you choose to participate in the conversation today, and this program is designed to be more than just a passive interview, it's a conversation we invite our audience to join. If you do so, we'll accept this as your implied consent to appear when we publish this on YouTube. We also invite everyone to please subscribe to our channel to help us grow and spread our work. And also click that bell icon so you can be notified when we do post new material. For those of you wishing to participate in today's program, please use the chat feature so I can keep an eye on it while we're talking with our guests. And if you would like to come on camera with and talk directly with our guest, just type the letter Q in, and that'll be my cue that you'd like to do so. And if you would prefer, just type your question in the chat, and I'll read and get to as many questions as we have time for. So on this edition of Transformations Cafe, we'll be continuing our explorations of spirituality, consciousness, and what we refer to as the Ageless Wisdom. Our guest refers to this as the Perennial philosophy.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure these are synonymous and they point to the same thing at least. Our guest is Dr. Edi Bilimoria, and he's authored what, to my admittedly limited knowledge, is the most comprehensive presentation on these topics of consciousness and spirituality, as well as its relationship to science. And the work addresses some of humanity's largest questions, like who are we? What does it mean to be human? What is consciousness? What is our relationship with each other, the planet, and the universe? And what do science, spirituality, and the ageless wisdom offer in answering these profound questions? So, in addition to Edi's outstanding 4-volume work, Unfolding Consciousness, and other printed works, he shares a tremendous number of resources on his website, social media channels, and YouTube, all of which we'll link to in the program description that will be on our YouTube channel. And in preparation for our conversation tonight, I actually found Edi through a tremendous interview that he had with Rick Archer on Buddha at the Gas Pump. And I also watched a 6-part series that he did with a gentleman named Jonathan Brown, who represented the publisher of Unfolding Consciousness. And I'm pointing to these to let our audiences know that there's a lot of information that I'm hoping we don't repeat totally, so that we bring something new and inspirational to the universe and our audiences. But if you want to learn more about Edi's fantastic work and maybe do it like I did and get the Cliff Notes version of Unfolding Consciousness, you can watch the videos and at least get your appetite whet. But I would encourage folks to look into it and also get the volumes, as you'll hopefully find out as we talk more with Edi this evening, understand why that's so critical to
There
make
is
part of
a
your library.
condensed volume coming out later this year.
Right. So I will be talking a little bit more of that as I read your official bio to make a formal introduction, and then we'll get into our conversation. So let me
Sure.
share screen while we do that. Dr. Edi Bilimoria brings a unique blend of experience to his exploration of consciousness. A student of the perennial philosophy, which again we refer to at IFGT as the Ageless Wisdom, for over half a century, he combines a deep understanding of ancient wisdom with a distinguished career in science and engineering. His latest work, Consciousness Came First, revealing evidence for universal intelligence and mind beyond the brain, will be published this December. And we are in the year 2025 for those who may be watching this in the future. It will be published by Collective Ink Publishers. This accessible edition condenses his acclaimed four-volume Unfolding Consciousness from 670,000 to 80,000 words, distilling its essential wisdom for a general audience. He has lectured and taught extensively in the UK and internationally, organizing conferences to foster dialogue between science, religion, and practical philosophy. His publications span the fields of science, engineering, and esoteric philosophy, with his magnum opus, Unfolding Consciousness, receiving the prestigious 2022 Grand Prize Award from the Scientific and Medical Network, with which IFGT is formally affiliated. His earlier work, The Snake and the Rope, also explores these themes. Educated at the universities of London, Sussex, and Oxford, and born in India, Dr. Bilimoria has also made significant contributions as an award-winning engineer and consultant for major infrastructure projects, including the Channel Tunnel and Royal Navy projects, such as the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier. So with that, I would like to welcome, as he graciously referred to me in an email, my comrade in arms on the spiritual path, Dr. Edi Bilimoria.
Thank you very much, Ken, my deep comrade in arms. And the arms that we bear are not weapons that kill, but the wisdom that enlightens.
I feel like we need a toast. That was wonderful. That
Here
was
you are.
yeah, here we are, drinking the miracle of water. Yes. So I thought what we would do is maybe start with some of the big questions, giving some framework so that maybe it orients people a little bit more to your work and your thinking, and then uh, see what our audience would like to do in terms of participating, but also maybe bring it into integrating uh, this work that you refer to as the perennial philosophy and these ideas um, with what's going on in the world today, because it certainly seems like we're in an era now that being aware of these things and being able to use them in ways that keep us grounded, centered, and able to continue to be comrades in arms and bring love and light, etc. I think those are important things. So with that, I think the big question to start out with is kind of two-part. Um, if you could give us your explanation of what is consciousness, and then how is our human experience related to consciousness?
Well, Ken, most people ask for a definition, but it is not something you can define in the same way as you can't define love or philanthropy or kindness. You can experience love. Now, you're talking in from Florida, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah. So I would invite you on a plane journey to London by night. And why by night? Because when you float over London, you see the beautiful lights that stretch from plus infinity to minus infinity. It's a, a tapestry of jewelry. Now, can you define your journey or can you experience it? Now, you would describe that experience, but a definition is something you put in a box with a label. So the trouble in science, in trying to understand consciousness, is they try and define it. And the trouble with definitions is it invokes the intellectual mind, the thinking left brain. And all our logical definitions are one-sided and partial. Why? Because they are bound to their starting point, which is the judging intellect and one particular angle of vision. So what people generally regard as a truth is really a one-sided argument. So just moving on from there, the intellect cannot prove the existence of such things as God or consciousness, which only a higher faculty can do. And consequently, the intellect cannot make any statements about what we loosely refer to as God and the higher self and consciousness, nor can the intellect disprove it. And the great sages and scientists have said this in their own way so forcefully, like Isaac Newton, like Jose Nasser, the great Iranian geophysicist, philosopher, like Krishnamurti, like Buddha, like Jesus. So now, just narrowing it down a little bit, we can adopt the apathetic approach, which is saying consciousness is not this, meaning not only this, not only this, or we can adopt the catapatic approach, it is everything. And why are people now and scientists getting so interested in consciousness? Because inwardly we realize that whatever neuroscience tells us, oh, we are only lumbering robots, we are only a biological machine, there is something in us that questions that. And when people are asking what is consciousness, they are saying, who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? So just without turning this into a lecture, I promise you,
Uh,
um, if we
which
now
would also
just
be fine.
uh, if we just think of ourselves before the great galaxies, the human body. Now, thanks to biological science, and this is in Erwin Laslow's book on Akasha, and no greater scientist than Erwin Laszlo. And the human body, he says in that book, contains 1,000,000,000,000 cells, more than the stars in the Milky Way. And of that cell population, 600 billion are dying and being regenerated every day, which makes about 10 million cells per second. But yet, there is that master organizing principle, the conductor of the orchestra. So you can regard consciousness in that way, not just the master organizing principle of the human body, but of the universe, our planet, and all being. So consciousness is the ground of our being and the very essence of our being. By whatever term you wish to use, of course, I mean, God is a loaded word.
Well, thank you, because I think you have helped give us kind of a paradigm shift. I
Mm.
think that is so sorely needed, especially for those that are in the West and have been kind of indoctrinated to the more science empirical thought approach, and exactly that
Mm.
if you can't measure it and you can't put an intellectual left brain
Mm.
definition to it, it either isn't real or isn't worth any further consideration. But this is a beautiful way of kind of politely but firmly saying that's we're
Thank
not
you.
thinking about it the right way if you do that, if that's how you're asking the question. So thank
And
you.
the tragedy is, Ken, that the greatest of scientists have said this,
Hmm.
but mainstream science ignores the wisdom of their greatest sons. No greater statement than Isaac Newton's General Scholium. As a blind man has no idea of colors, so we have no idea about the divine presence. Um, Jose, I mentioned NASA. I said he says the failure of science to encompass the real is because science works through the intellect and the physical senses, and it has to transcend that. Schrödinger put it so beautifully in his book, What is Life? That we know thoroughly, quantitatively, about music as the compression and rarefaction of airwaves on the eardrum, and then an electrochemical process in the brain. That's what happens, which is fine. But why? Why does an old song reduce you to tears, or me certainly? So science talks about the what and the how, but not the why. It tells us what the constituent of the planet, galaxy is, the body, but to what purpose? Why? Just to amuse themselves? No. So then Schrödinger goes on to say in that book, and we're talking about one of the greatest scientists, that science pretends to answer these questions, but the answers are sometimes so silly we don't take them seriously. It doesn't mean science is silly. It means science has to live within its limitations, or if it wants to ask deeper questions, it has to step on to the ageless wisdom, the eternal wisdom. And as Schrödinger put it, that mainstream Western science needs some blood transfusion from the East. But
Yes.
the blood transfusion has to be done carefully. We don't want blood clots.
Yeah.
In other words, we
Love it.
don't want to lose what science has given us, the
Right.
precision, the quantification, the replication, but it needs a blood transfusion.
I have several questions to refer to, and I'm wondering which one to ask first after that. So maybe we should start or continue by asking then, when we say science, what does that mean?
The origin is scientia from the verb scere, to know. And it means to know everything or want to know. It essentially means asking questions, as Socrates always pointed out. The philosopher is the man who is aware of what he doesn't know and asks questions. Now, I would say that look at it in terms very simply of three concentric circles. The first circle is what you might call materialistic science. Physics and chemistry are obviously vital. The problem is not materialism. We need materialism for our everyday existence. Our Zoom wouldn't work without materialism. Our cars, our washing machines, airplanes, so we need it. But materialism and its associated reductionism are excellent. So if you have a problem with your physical eyes, then you resort to material science. But if you try and push materialism into areas where it has no prominence, like asking the deeper questions and trying to reduce everything in life in terms of physics and chemistry, then you just run the ship aground. So the first circle is certainly materialism, physics and chemistry. This quantification, a number. The second circle would be a science of qualities. For example, Brian Goodwin, Schumacher College in England. It's still within the realm of number, but number has quality as well. It's not just quantity. But then that second circle lives within the wider circle of science in capital S, which stops short of nothing. It investigates everything. So mysticism is as much a part of that as anything else. And science with a capital S works through union and participation. You don't find out the secrets of a butterfly's flight or anything else by killing it and dismembering the body. You enter into union with the whatever you're trying to investigate. And Einstein said when he was meditating on light, he became a beam of light, so to speak. Newton's great discoveries were made in that state, the yogi state, if you like, of samadhi, where he, object and subject, merged into the mystic state of union. So there are three levels of science, and all three levels are important. It's not a war between one and the other. The important point is the context. So can I give you a quick example? I've just thought of it now to illustrate the difference.
Please.
And examples do help. I do have a beautiful lake 5 minutes away from where I live. It's not my lake, it's a fishing lake. And whatever the weather in England, I go out there for half an hour and go, well, running's a strong word, stop, start jogging. And there's a beautiful playing field. And I love to watch the children in the playing field. And I have to be careful not to stand there too often because they're going to think, who's this chap? But what is so beautiful is to see these young souls being completely natural, just loving it. Now, let's just assume that a child is on a slide and she comes down at such a steep angle that she bashes her face and knocks a tooth out. Now, because the slide was at a too steep an angle, so then the slide manufacturer is going to be called and say, hey, look, you better redesign your slide. So from the slide manufacturer's point of view, all he's concerned with is the translation of potential energy at a height to kinetic energy at the bottom. Yeah. It could be a child coming down, a child weighing, I don't know, 30 pounds. I still like to talk in terms of pounds. It could be a stone coming down. It makes no difference, neglecting air friction. It's mass coming down a slope. So from that point of view, from physics and mechanics is all you need. You know, you don't invoke homeopathy and faith healing because it's a mechanical problem. Now, say the child knocks out her tooth and mummy takes the child to a dentist. From the dentist's point of view, the tooth is an object. It doesn't mean the child is an object, but from his professional point of view, he's dealing with an object. Of course, like any nice dentist like mine, and I'm a chicken, the dentist will say, just raise your finger when it hurts. But professionally, we're dealing with an object. But is the dentist going to say, how much do you weigh? No. The weight of the child means everything to the slide manufacturer. It means nothing to a dentist. What's that going to do with it? Different context. Now, finally, say the little girl grows up to be an elegant, beautiful lady and has traumas about childhood experience, perfectly feasible, and goes to a psychiatrist. Is the psychiatrist going to say, how much do you weigh? No. That what the psychiatrist is not interested in an object, it's the soul quality, the inner being. So as Carl Jung said so beautifully, so much of depression and these problems is a homesickness of the soul. So the psychiatrist will look at the inner person, and that's a different science from the science of mechanics and the science of dentistry. But it's all within that whole circumference of science, which is to explore and to know at the level and the context where you're asking the question.
And going back to the root of the word and its relationship to knowing and the desire to know.
Scary. Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting because I think that is part of our human nature. Once, as you and I were talking about, once we
Yes.
have the ability to not have to uh, function at the lowest levels of Maslow's hierarchy, for instance, once we've
Mm,
addressed food, clothing, shelter, and safety, then
mm,
we can have the luxury, if you will, of beginning to
mm,
wonder
mm,
and find these various paths of trying to know. And I'll
mm,
just I can relate this briefly to my life now, and then use that as a intro to the next question in terms of your thoughts on kind of the spiritual journey or path. But I can tell you that in my earlier adult life, in fact, even starting as a child, I was fascinated by science and medicine, and at one point designed a career in neuroscience research because at that time I believed that everything that we did and thought and experienced emotionally, et cetera, had some correlation or correspondence to something in the brain. And that once we had, perfectly mapped out all aspects of behavior and experience, we could know exactly where in the brain that was, and then hopefully how to treat any illnesses or problems. And over time, I've now come to realized that I had to surrender that because that actually isn't what I come to know more deeply now, and yet I don't have problem understanding that it's not either or. And I think part of what
mm.
you've done so beautifully in your work is show that, and you've said that as much today too, that it's not that we're now thinking science is bad and doesn't have a role, or that
Far from it.
esoteric work is all just kind of, as they say, woo woo, and there's nothing realistic to it, and we need to be more scientifically focused. It's part of the everything that you provided in your first answer about what is consciousness.
But Ken, you mentioned, sorry to interrupt, if I
No,
may, a
please.
vital word correlated through the brain. And now one sees neuroscience in a desperate attempt to try and find how the brain generates consciousness.
Yes,
Like 3 years ago, the Templeton Foundation were awarding a $25 million prize to two cleverly designed experiments to see how the brain generates consciousness, despite the fact that this generate consciousness is being seriously questioned. Now, the question presupposes the answer to it. To say how the brain generates consciousness presupposes that it does in the first place.
correct.
Whereas the ageless wisdom, this is sorry, so important, has never said the brain generates consciousness. Now, there are three, I mean, every part of the body is a consciousness center, but there are three main consciousness centers: the heart, the brain, and the generative system. And that wonderful English Platonist, Thomas Taylor, said, light, when viewed subsisting in the sun, in the fountain of light, the sun, There is light immediately proceeding from the sun, the light rays, and the splendor communicated by the rays of the light to all beings. That relates to the heart, the seat of consciousness, the rays of light proceeding from the sun, the brain, and the generative system. Now, the heart as the seat of consciousness, the brain is the middle point. The brain unites life and form, spirit and matter. So the brain is the organ of highest physical dignity. The generative system is the organ of least physical dignity, but most highest physical importance, because like the rays of the sun, the splendor from the sun, the generative system communicates splendor to all life through the procreative function. But the brain is not the generator of consciousness. I cannot emphasize that. And Blavatsky put it so beautifully that if we put all thought down to brain work, it is only because in that mansion, the human body, the brain is the outer door leading to the objective external world. All the other doors are private inner doors through which pass the sensations and feelings. And the vividness of those sensations and feelings depends on the organic soundness of the inner organs. So the ageless wisdom is completely unequivocal in pointing out that the brain is not the generator of consciousness. It is like the transducer, to use another analogy, let's say a CD player. The CD heads, or let's go to the television. The tiger in your television is not a tiger in your television. The television's a transducer that makes visible the invisible signals. So I'm laboring the point, but the heart, the brain, the generative system, and let's never forget religion. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So I have, in my own words, I would say to anyone, especially a scientist, think with the heart and feel with the brain.
And that is perhaps a form of what I was hoping to hear from you next in terms of when we think about um, our spiritual journeys, and we often hear the term awakening kind of used with that.
Mm.
Sometimes people use the term enlightenment, but I
Yeah,
like to kind of shy away from some of these because they begin to get loaded
it
at
gets
this
cliched.
point.
Yeah, it gets
Right.
cliched. Mm.
But as we proceed and to do something like make a shift like you just did, where you would, you know, think with the heart and feel with the brain, and to bring that to someone uh, Western scientifically oriented, that would probably throw like slamming on the brakes maybe and a little whiplash. But on our spiritual journeys, as we've heard from some of the people we've had as guests before, like Philip Wade, uh,
Mm.
we have a lot of work from Michael Singer. Our
Mm.
guest next month, Lissa Friedman, has also talked about various forms of self-realization, which involves some process or processes of the awareness is in recognizing we're the observer. And part of what we begin to observe and do is recognize what are beliefs versus truths,
Mm.
and what are our attachments, what role our attachments in any form kind of play to uh, recognizing them as such, and then moving more into kind of a self-realized state. So with all of your work and study, I'm kind of just wondering what your thoughts are along those lines, and maybe both what you've experienced on your path, as well as what maybe the wisdom says about this from your study of it.
Well, you don't necessarily need a real near-death experience
Hmm.
to experience the truth, the wisdom as we're given that death is transition and not extinction. So, in terms of enlightenment, or that the word enlightenment and awakening both imply an opening of the eyes and a receiving of light. Now, there is the external light, but there is the internal light, and the internal light is the real awakening that you're talking about. And I can only say that each person has to find their own way. But surely the golden rule is choose what inspires you. And what inspires you will, money won't figure. The more money figures and the more accolades and patting on the back and all of that, the less you're going to find whatever you're looking for. The less you're interested in compliments and money and, you know, the more you will find your path and the more you will be inspired. So find what inspires you, and that will be the process of awakening. But also, painful experiences seen in their true light are, I'm afraid, the best awakeners in many times. And this is where the whole question of individual karma comes in, which is hardly a subject you hear mentioned or talked about. I mean, how can people, brutal politicians, how can they behave and act the way they are if they understood even 1% of karma? And there I can only, I think of this so often, I can only offer my resolution of that problem. Their ghastly behavior is Christ's words on the cross, Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They are utterly blind. So, in terms of following one's spiritual path, depending on one's temperament, of course, we are drawn to this or that. It's very important, I would say, Ken, not to be too dogmatic, obviously, and to be aware of other paths. Be as universal as you can, but follow your own path. Follow your own path, but be universal in your approach.
And in following that path, I think maybe backing up a little bit and asking if you can define or describe the perennial philosophy or ageless wisdom, because from what I've learned so far, it has been presented for thousands of years in various forms, and it's
Mm.
and the analogy or model that rings for me all the time is the many paths up the mountain, and
The
that
many paths here, or
yeah,
if you like, the many tributaries from the one source.
right.
But and the source is so extremely pure that few of us can wade up the stream that far. But the many streams from that source are colored by the culture and the temperament and the climate and the era we live in. But one can discern that golden thread of consistency. So the perennial philosophy has been called in many ways, the most beautiful word in Sanskrit is the Sutratma thread. Sutratma means sacred thread, the sacred thread that binds together, but we're not just binding together a whole of disparate things into one mass. It's binding together into one organic being. So the perennial philosophy is the sacred thread that strings together all the sciences, religions, and philosophies and presents them as one organic entity.
That's fantastic. I've been searching for some way to kind of give that elevator definition. If someone who really had no familiarity with it, that's wonderful. Thank you, Eddie. I think that really helps because it's not something that speaks to only one thing. There's so much to it as
Yeah,
three large volumes of work and many more and years of
yeah.
study that many of us in IFGT have been involved with, and some of the people joining us tonight have been uh, my classmates, and
And that
it's
sacred
kind of
thread,
never
that's the
ending.
Pratma, also strings together all the various um, aspects of the human constitution, the physical, obviously, um, the etheric, the astral, the lower mental, the higher mental, the intuition, and the Atma. It's that sacred thread that unites all as one organic entity.
But there is, and I was kind of asking this in the first question too.
Mm,
We have the ability to learn about things like the perennial philosophy, ageless wisdom, to
mm,
come to know it first, maybe intellectually, and then
of
embody it
course.
and
Hmm.
come to deeper knowings. And yet we're also still living in a human world with all of its various infinite spectrum of emotions and opportunities and challenges. And the times that we live in seem to be our times version of very a lot of unsettling things happening, maybe a lot of change at least, which seems to
Certainly a
go
lot of
against
change.
some of our human wiring to maybe not deal with uncertainty, for instance, without quite a bit of ability to quiet and center and meditate, etc. So I think maybe if we can talk a bit about, so what can the wisdom help us understand about living in times like this, and where might we find some balance, some grounding, and some hope.
Yes, we did talk about hope and despair, and my
This is
gosh,
when you and I talked a few days
yeah,
ago.
I know, and you
Yeah.
mentioned hope, and there is no shortage of despair at the moment, and one has to be sensitive in responding to that question. It's absolutely no good and thoroughly callous to say, "Oh, just get out of it," and it happens to everyone, and yeah, other people suffer, and these sort of wisecracks don't help the situation at all. So, my first point would be to say, as far as possible, simplify your life. Don't clutter it up with things that are so important. And unfortunately, I'm going to swear, the most damn trivial things can assume an artificial importance. And don't we know the problems with IT and all of that? But as far as possible, simplify your life. The As far as possible, silence is so important. Contact with nature. There's nothing new, I'm telling you, of course. But find something, as I said earlier, that inspires you. And the communication and the communion of wonderful friends is of paramount importance when one feels downcast or in despair. So, again, going back to science, religion, philosophy, science will only help us, I mean, physical science, more or less, which is important. Science helps us to live efficiently, religion to help us to live morally, and philosophy to live ethically. So try and get that balance right. But when one is in despair, you don't want a load of sermons any more than if you're struggling for breath when you're drowning. You don't want someone teaching you how to swim. You want someone to jump in and get you out. Well, who's going to jump in and get you out other than ultimately you yourself and the help of loving friends and divine intervention, which does come if one asks for it. But our whole value system, and I cannot emphasize this too strongly, our whole value system is based on the external. We talk about economic security. Oh, well, we've heard enough of that. National security, economic. The real riches are the inner treasures, not the outer treasures. We need enough to live decently. That's fine. Look at nature. Just look at nature. Now, if a little child um, stayed at a height of 2 feet at the age of 20, something's gone wrong. If at the age of 20 the child were 200 meters, something's gone wrong. Equally, a tree grows to its natural height. So growth, I'm sick and tired of hearing in England, growth, growth, growth. Growth can be a cancer. There has to be physical growth, but then there has to be inner growth. Outer riches, inner riches. So in the first quarter of life, obviously you grow physically, you grow your finances, you grow your physical surroundings, you grow your family. But after that, why do you want 20 billion? Then you have to grow inwardly. So the value system, I would suggest, is completely skewed in terms of worshipping the outer and not the inner. So if one reorientated the value system, a lot of despair, I haven't got this, I haven't got that, would dissolve, because then you would see value in things that at one time you didn't.
I'm going to share just for those that haven't told yet. Eddie was very generous in giving me the chance to meet him prior to today, and we had a lovely talk for quite some time a few days ago. And one of the things you said that uh, kind of summarizes but captured so beautifully your last point here was that every growth has its natural limit in the outer world, but the
Mm.
inner world is limitless.
Yes.
These are what we take with us to the other world.
Yes, absolutely. I remember saying that. Yeah.
And I think the in keeping this tied back in the context of, okay, so in these contemporary times that can seem so confusing and chaotic, and then uh, play on some of the most difficult things like our fears and
Mm.
insecurities.
Mm.
If we not only listen to your earlier answer about some things that have been said by many others, but what I'm hearing you say that puts it in somewhat of a new note is that instead of only focusing on what's outside and not just the material wealth and abundance in cancerous abundance, perhaps, but also getting sucked into some of the hyperbole that
Mm.
triggers all of these difficult thoughts and emotions. Go inward, spend the time inward and get quiet
Mm.
and connect to those parts of ourself and consciousness that really, at least as we're starting out and growing in this way spiritually, you need to have the quiet. You need to be able to focus and attend. But it's just a beautiful way to put it that
Mm. Thank
the
you.
internal treasures are limitless.
Yes, they are. And that wonderful, wonderful book, The Light on the Path by Mabel Collins, very much a contemporary of Blavatsky. She talked about three truths, and the third one is that the soul of man, the soul of man being human beings, of course, the soul of man is a thing whose growth and splendor is utterly limitless. But also each man is his own lawgiver, the giver of gloom and doom to himself and treasures.
Yeah. Which goes back to
Saying
this
that, you
idea
have to be
of,
careful saying that because someone really suffering is not going to say, "Well, I caused it." You know, one has to look at it in the wider sense, of course.
I agree, but that is also, from what I've experienced at least, and I think come to study, that's part of the unfolding and awakening is doing that difficult inner work, which
Yes.
often involves coming face to face with those beliefs that we have, which may include, oh, my life is so full of suffering. And indeed, it may be, but that is not all of it oftentimes.
Mm,
And
mm,
sometimes it is coming to different relationship with how we see things and even coming to understand what it is that we believed and didn't even know we believed it.
sure.
Yeah. You said something else when we met a few days ago that I think is important to share with
Hmm.
more people. When we did talk about, we got into it a little bit about some of the current personalities that seem to be ruling
Mm,
our world and having great influence and the difficulties they present. And so then, well, where can we find hope again versus just in falling into
mm,
despair? And I'll read what you said, and then maybe we can expand on it
yeah,
a
sure.
little bit. You said, despair is destructive. It's like a virus.
Mm,
Hope from long-term comes from long-term optimism. Hope lies in the fact that we are fundamentally spiritual beings.
yes.
The outer form indeed suffers, but hope lies in the fact that there is evolution. Each particle is aspiring toward a greatness to discover its beloved, where it came from, not to say, just at the individual level, there may be little hope as you've been talking about, but when we come to understand that. So, anything else you want to add to
I can't believe I said that.
that? Well, you
Um,
were channeled. It came through you.
well, thank you. Yeah. Well, let's just bring in the great Rumi, the great Sufi
Hmm.
saint, when he talked of evolution in the true sense of the term, not just physical Darwinian evolution, which is only a part of it, where each kingdom of nature aspires to a higher state of being in order to be united with the beloved. But the mineral kingdom can't unite with the beloved in one leap. It has to go through the vegetable kingdom. But the vegetable kingdom has to go through the animal and the human and then the superhuman. So here we find that the higher kingdom always extends a hand downwards to help
Hmm.
the lower kingdom, parent and child. So you have a two-way process of obedience upwards and loving reverence downwards, where each particle wants to unite with its source in consciousness, in full consciousness. So whether we climb mountains, and this is, I would say, a serious point, even those who want billions and yachts and jet aircraft and want to put a flag on Mars, inwardly it is saying, I'm looking for myself. But the trouble is, I'm projecting it outwards. So the search for self, whether it's true spiritual progress, altruism, helping others, or wanting your billions and your yacht and your private jet, truly it is a search for self. And as Yogananda put it so eloquently, that it's all very well exploring the outer space, but the exploration of the outer space is fundamentally the exploration of the inner space. So therefore, Paul Brunton, again, wonderful. What a great sage. We have to mentalize space and spatialize mind. Space, time, and mind are one entity, but there is outer space and there's inner space. So everything, in a sense, again, is a search for self.
And
For
sometimes
true
those
self.
right. And I think sometimes all those the larger outward acts and the those
Mm.
the gathering of more and more material wealth, for instance, is I think in some ways maybe a reflection of how desperate in some sense those people might be to try to find that inner self, but how afraid they are to actually look inward.
The inner poverty is very sad.
Yeah. Which also then gets to another point, I think, of what the wisdom points to in all its forms, which
Mm.
is about love and compassion,
Oh,
and
yes.
certainly beyond the greeting card versions of those.
Oh,
But to
yeah.
be able to even empathize with something like someone that appears to be perhaps visiting a lot of harm on a
Mm.
great number of people,
Mm.
but finding a way to find some note of compassion even for
Some
them.
connection. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Which is, takes a bit of work. Takes
That
a bit of work.
takes, well, it certainly takes character. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to remind, briefly and interrupt myself, that this is something we invite our audience to participate in. I'm guessing, like me, you've kind of spellbound them. But I want to remind folks that if you have questions, to please either type the letter Q in the chat and
Mm.
speak with Eddie directly, or type your question or
Mm.
comment, and we'll read them. Um,
Ken, sorry, can I come in here? Because you mentioned love and compassion. So, what is love in this higher sense? One thinks of the great Schiller, who Beethoven, of course, immortalized. And Schiller said that the universe is a thought of deity. And that was said also by the great scientist Sir James Jeans, that the universe seems more like a great thought than a machine. Thank you, scientists, but Schiller said it before you. The universe is a thought of the deity, but since this thought has overspilled into what we call reality, it is the task of our thinking beings to rediscover the original design. So that overspill is an act of love. It is love in the highest sense. It is, if you love, you don't keep it yourself. You have to overspill,
yeah.
so to speak. But now talking of all the ghastliness that happens, one of the uh, profound sayings by Paul Brunton in his wonderful book In Search of Secret Egypt, and the message he was given
Yeah.
was the creator loves all. They're using the word creator, of course, in the popular sense, not a god with a white beard, of course. The creator being the divine principle, the creator loves all, but he has enacted laws over us such that when man looks upon man with hate, he is destroyed by his own iniquities. So, when you see all the destruction, there's no point in blaming God. You're transgressing the divine law of love. And if you transgress the law of love by looking on your fellow beings with hatred and I want your bit of land and I want your minerals and I want to walk into your country, well, then those iniquities will inevitably, by virtue of the divine law, reap their natural consequences.
You had a wonderful, and I don't want to, I do want to, yes, give another nod to Paul Breton and anybody that hasn't read his work or become familiar, dive in. He's a fantastic writer, and what he writes about is captivating, and it will help you grow and shift. It really is amazing. Um, in one of the talks you have with Jonathan Brown,
Mm.
you were, I think, talking about the same point, and I don't want to put you on the spot if you
That's
don't
all
have
right.
it at hand, but you had wonderful slides, and one of them, I believe you were using the term antikarana
Oh,
in
yeah. Oh,
talking
yeah,
about
sure.
and likening it to a conductor that
Yeah,
if it had too much resistance, it would heat and basically cause
sure.
some destruction to that wire, if you would. And I
Mm.
think that's what you're talking about here, that it is possible that we can act in such ways that we get so far removed from some of these universal laws as the one you were just describing, that we damage our connection to
Yeah,
that spirit.
absolutely. The Antakarana is one of the most vital pieces of esoteric science that I think the sooner psychiatry takes it on board seriously, um, the better, because we see people who are so, so, so-called divinely inspired. I think of Mozart, of course, and Schubert and the great writers, and some people who are invincibly criminal. Now, why? The Antakarana, the word means internal instrument, and it's the connection between the higher self and the personality. The higher self as parent, the wisdom, and the personality is the naughty child that the parent needs to discipline. Now, the more selfish, the more brutal, the more cruel our existence, we thin that connection, we thin it, such that at one stage, that connection is completely snapped. And then we have what is known in the ageless wisdom as soulless beings. Robert Louis Stevenson's wonderful book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when Mr. Hyde found he was subjected to unbelievable forces that he had no control over. So when that connection is snapped, we have that most dangerous situation of soulless beings, either in incarnation or out of incarnation. And the fate of such beings is terrible, of course. And Dante's Divine Comedy gives you an allegorical depiction of that. But on the flip side, of course, the more altruistic, the nobler, the more philanthropic, the more aspirational our thoughts are, the more we strengthen the conductor such that the higher self can bring down more of its wisdom into the personality,
So
such that,
go ahead,
sorry,
sir.
in the final analysis, when we are so merged with the higher self, then you don't need the antakarana.
Yeah.
There's no point in having a bridge when you've crossed it.
Hmm.
But if you burn the bridge before you cross it, good luck.
And for those that may have had that experience of the antikarana being severed, would a more contemporary description of that might be someone who's just diagnosed as a psychopathic individual or sociopathic?
Yes, yes. But um, unconscionable. I mean, I'm not saying you have to be careful that every sociopath is completely severed. I'm thinking in England, I mean, maybe there was that few years, that ghastly case of the Moors murderers, where a ghastly couple took absolutely delight in torturing young children over a period of years. So, but the point is this, that even if there is the flimsiest thread, there is the possibility of a reconnection. And one of my very good friends a long time ago in the Theosophical Society was the great Judge Christmas Humphreys. And he was an Old Bailey judge. He knew some criminals, I mean, as a judge. And he said very, very few criminals don't express real remorse. So it's the completely remorseless where the anticoron has been severed. If there's even a glimmer of remorse, there is the possibility of reconnection. So, in terms of the Eastern analogy or the description, the anticoronana could be like the farmer who has his laborers tilling the field. And if the laborer brings even one sheaf of corn, the farmer is happy to keep them going. But when that one sheaf of corn does not come, then the field is abandoned and the laborers go. So these are all the different allegories and metaphors used in the Ageless Wisdom to show the importance of always strengthening that connection with the higher self.
Yeah. Um, are you familiar with uh, discussions of the role of the Antikarana and its larger severing with humanity during the Atlantean period?
During the Atlantean, well,
Yeah,
that's a huge question.
yeah, okay, maybe beyond the scope of this evening, but
No, but just in the broadest terms, the great Atlantean civilization, no, we can relate it to what's happening now. I mean, yes, we can. Um, the Atlantean civilization, like unfortunately all great civilizations, we can think of the Roman civilization in our time. It went through its period of glory and then its total immorality when man looked upon man with hate, such that the great majestic continent was then destroyed by forces of nature. Now we're seeing not quite that extreme, thank goodness, but we're seeing that phenomena where there is this quality of hatred between people. And hatred is one of the most corrosive things ever to nurture. And I would say there is that spectrum from like to love, dislike to hatred. When you like someone, you want to be in their company. When you love someone, you really want to help them on their path. You want to be with them on their path. If you dislike someone, you don't want to be in their company. But when you hate someone, you actively want to injure them. And that's the worst thing to do. And we are seeing this phenomena happening now. Not to the extent that Atlantis was destroyed, but I would say be careful.
yeah,
Don't hate the other. You may dislike the other, but you don't have to hate anyone. You can feel sorry for them.
which gets back to this idea of compassion, I think.
Well, compassion, as Krishnamurti put it, is energy for all things.
Uh,
It's
yeah,
energy for all life, energy for all life.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's, I mean, these are hugely important things to revisit and
Mm.
remember. And then when we talked earlier about, the inner journey and looking inward and the treasures there, as we grow spherically,
Mm.
and so this idea of compassion also goes inward and to be compassionate
Yes,
with ourselves. So if we do find
absolutely.
ourselves struggling to not hate someone, for instance, or at least, to allow them to do what they're doing, maybe don't knock ourselves too hard either for being
Yeah.
human.
Then I've been told more than once, you have to have compassion for yourself as well. Don't
Yeah,
be too hard on yourself. Yes, there is
yeah,
compassion for oneself as well. That is, you've struck a very important note. Don't be too hard on yourself.
yeah.
It is easy to do, of course.
I want to shift a little bit, Eddie,
Mm,
because since I'm blatantly taking advantage of the opportunity to speak with you and share your work with our audiences, both
mhm.
with us today and those that will be seeing this in the future on YouTube. And one of the things that IFGT has been identifying kind of with and working toward is a term that we absolutely did not coin, but we're applying it perhaps in a little different way, the tipping point, and
Oh
that
yeah.
point where
Mm,
we would reach that next stage of kind of unfolded consciousness, if you will,
mhm,
that it
mm.
becomes something. And so I'm curious if you think, are you seeing or do you think that we are moving collectively towards this?
Well, what do you mean by collectively? Do you mean globally or nationally or in terms of society? I certainly see in science this tipping point because by droves now, scientists are questioning the materialistic assumption. Many scientists are now open to the whole question of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, where 20 years ago, even the word consciousness was banned. So there is this tipping point in science, in neuroscience. So that I'm very optimistic about. In, in the wider sense, oh gosh, don't know. Well, or rather, I can't see it yet.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Because on the one hand, one reference point we can use is uh, when IFDT was founded,
Mm,
coming up on 22 years ago, I believe.
mm,
Marianne Miller uh, founded this organization when
mm.
the internet was much closer to its infancy, and
Yes.
organizations like this were nowhere near in number to what they are
Mm,
today.
mm.
And now, and I think even within, say, the past 5 years, they're
They've really
gone from kind of,
proliferated.
well,
Mm,
but you would need lifetimes to consume all of the information that's available now on this that used
mm,
to be. In fact,
mm.
you define in some of the work that I saw in preparation for this conversation what esoteric means, but it was deliberately kept from being
Yeah, yeah.
popularly and publicly disseminated. This type
Mm.
of information. So in that regard, I wonder, do you agree that there is at least growth in that way? It may not be reflected in some of what we're seeing, and it's hard to believe, but despite that, do you think
Despite
we're
that,
evolving?
there is an opening up
Yeah.
of what was once closeted. And of course, that opening up has dangers, like anything. But I think it is a necessary step. And that tremendous opening up was done by none other than the Theosophical Society,
Hmm.
where secrets hitherto hidden were made public or unveiled, put it that way, but put through a scientific idiom, which is very important, with the corroboration from the exact sciences of that time.
Yes. So I'm thinking also about, we talked a little bit about teaching the wisdom, and I shared with you some of the discussions IFGT has had over the years about how best to share this information. I'm curious, what are your hopes in creating works like Unfolding Consciousness and the volume you're working on to publish later this year?
Well, firstly, I didn't have an identifiable goal in the sense that, I want to write a book that X people could read and obviously make a lot of money. I mean, forget it.
Hmm.
You don't write that sort of thing to make money. But my wish or hope, if you like, was to try and transmit my love for the wisdom
Hmm.
and my love of science, philosophy, and music. But my other more focused hope was my extreme annoyance and anger at the way in which even esoteric societies get so utterly dogmatic. And that's a tragedy. Even in the Theosophical Society, you've got to read this book. No, don't listen to him. No, that's the ultimate. There's no gold standard. So one of my favorite chapters, if I can put it that way, is chapter 7 of volume 2, where I've tried to show how the esoteric kernel of the great religions speak with one voice. They all talk, the Greek philosophers, the Zoroastrian, the Christian, Rudolf Steiner, psychosynthesis, the Buddhists, they all talk with one voice in the sense of the higher self, the immortal, the personality, the various levels of the soul. So part of my writing was that irritation of trying to show that don't be so dogmatic. You've got to be universal in your approach.
That's I don't know. I'm gonna not have the right word because I'd say something like awesome, but it's beautiful. It
Mm.
really is a beautiful thing to have
So
had that as your intent and your
if
wish.
you stand in the center of the circle, it's not being a jack of all trades. If you stand in the center of the circle, you can go along any radius, being Christian or Islam or Buddhist or whatever, but always come back to that center.
Right, right, right. Well, from what I have learned so far of your work, you've accomplished what you set out to do, and
Oh,
I do think that it's a beautiful thing to have available to us now. It really
thank
is,
you.
because if anyone has any interest and they want to learn more, and it's available, and not
Mm,
long ago, it would have been very hard to find, and
mm,
it would have been very hard to kind of put it all together and find those common threads, which in some ways is a very scientific thing to do, right?
mm,
You've taken the finding in one lab and shown how
mm.
it's reproducible. That's a very
Yeah.
scientific principle.
Mhm.
But I think it's very helpful because, as we also talked about when we met earlier, discernment is one of those aspects of growth and skills that need to be developed. And
And
one,
maybe we live in such a confusing world. We are flooded with information and IT and emails so that we could develop that quality of discernment and discrimination, which is buddhi, the next higher level of consciousness above mind, as you rightly said. Mm.
and so we are just trying to discern so we know what is likely true,
Mm.
right? And what we can then build on and rely on.
Mm.
And one of the sources, at least I've found so far, is in concert with unfolding consciousness and your work, because you're showing how the same things repeat. And that's
Mm.
and if you find the same answers in multiple different places and multiple stated different ways, but they point to the
Exactly.
same thing, that I
That
think is
provides
something you
confidence.
can, yes,
Mm.
it says this, you can count on this. This is for real.
Mm. When multiple sources, independent, semi-independent sources, will hit on the same essential truth, well, then you have confidence that it's not someone's brainchild or fantasy or funny idea, because all those thousands of years ago, they weren't emailing each other and comparing notes. Because what the great sages have done and the musicians, they have extended their antenna into that universal inkwell of divine wisdom, but they have written from that ink in their own handwriting. So the ink is one, the handwriting's different. So the ink being the wisdom, the handwriting being the expression in which it is expressed. Express means to press out of. So it's very important to make the wisdom contemporary
Yeah.
and not use the expressions and norms that prevail, or use them, but also update them using modern metaphors and modern analogies and modern science.
Yeah, that's a point I've several times during this conversation. You reminded me of someone else that we had as a guest, Betty Kovach, who I don't know
Yeah.
if you're familiar with Betty, but she's done a beautiful job of looking at the different times in human history where the wisdom began to be more well known and popular,
Mm,
and then
mm,
up to now, it's kind of always been squashed and drowned out, and
mm.
its communicators often met with very disturbing fates.
Yeah.
But we may now be in this next era, at least that's what Betty's very studied and learned opinion is. So, we do have a question from Dina. Go ahead, Dina.
Okay, let me see if I can articulate this. Um, in the world of commerce, it's always about more profits,
Mm,
than last year. And it seems like that's unsustainable. That's going to destroy our planet or cannibalize, the industries. I know Apple's launching a new phone and wondering why people aren't rushing out to buy, getting rid of their old phones. So I wanted to ask, do you think a new paradigm will arise for business where there will be sustainability would be, people would think, what a great company. They keep a sustainable growth. Anyway, thank you.
mm. Very, very relevant question because I mentioned limitless growth as really a road to perdition. The business model for so many companies is more growth, more growth, more orders, more orders. But when growth is sustainable, then it's like a human being or a tree that has reached its natural height, but then you're feeding and watering it so that it can provide beautiful fruit and do its job as it's meant to be. So I think the green movement, whatever people may say about it, is uh, providing a bit of a thorn in the backside of big businesses that are based, that their business model is unsustainable growth at the expense of the planet, at the expense of all of us. And only a little bit of common sense would tell them that this is nonsense. Because think of the pollution, think of the effects on other companies. Apple, of course, I know are launching a new product and they want everyone to buy it. And what a nuisance having to learn a new lot of completely useless finger strokes just because it's been forced on you. So increasingly, I'm getting fed up with IT being forced down my throat. I now have to upgrade to Windows 11, not because I want to, but if I don't, they're not going to provide the updates. So it's this sort of growth which is damaging, in my opinion, which scatters the mind. It doesn't do anything for the product. It's just another load of bells and whistles and things to prod and twitch. So sustainable growth is very important. And I think, Dina, you made a very good point there.
And as things evolve, because something that you've shared again is that we can count on the fact of evolution, that
Mm.
things continue to change, and so at some point, I think that suggests at least that the current model of corporate growth that Dina is asking about has to
It,
change.
it has to change. It has to change before we are forced to change by nature.
Mhm. Right.
Look at climate change, look at deforestation, look at the forest fires. Why do things in a panic when you can do things calmly by reflection beforehand? In my opinion, or my limited consideration, the health model is very largely business-based, not health-based, if I may put it that way.
Don't get me started. No, it's very
Uh,
true. Actually, I wanted to mention to you, Eddie, too, in one of your talks with Jonathan Brown, you mentioned someone who is on our advisory board, Amit Goswami, and
oh, Amit Goswami,
yeah,
yes, yes.
and and I interviewed him and a co-author about their
Mm,
then at least latest new model for healthcare and medicine, and
mm, mm.
it is along these same lines of kind of the medical equivalent to Dina's question about sustainable growth. That the current
Yes.
medical model is not, and healthcare models are not sustainable, and so
Mm, mm.
they have a very considered study and proposal for a new model that's encouraging. I think that a lot of these things can also be sources of encouragement when, if we
Yes,
don't look a little further, it seems
yes.
like all that's around us can be very discouraging. So
Mm,
there are a lot of great
thank
thinkers,
you.
a lot of
Mm.
wonderful contributions, very much including you. I want to make sure that if there's anything else you wanted to share, that we give you that opportunity, and perhaps you can give us at least a little teaser of this new book, Consciousness Came First, and maybe because you told me it's not simply an abridged version of Unfolding
No,
Consciousness.
it's not an abridged. It's really a recasting of the original volumes with the wonderful help of Tim Wyatt, who was a wartime journalist, and journalists know how to pick up the kernels
Hmm.
and put it together. So it's a restatement of the original four volumes. And I was going back now. I talked about the inkwell of wisdom, didn't I, a little earlier? So one of the great sayings is, if you want to follow your own path, don't imitate what I do, seek what I sought.
Yeah.
So if one great person has climbed up the ladder to the inkwell, to the pool, don't climb up his ladder. You won't. Climb up your ladder. So don't follow my path, but seek what I sought in the ultimate. So independent thinking and not imitating is another hard lesson, of course. It doesn't mean you don't draw on the wisdom of those who have climbed up the path. I mean, for goodness sake, Mozart learned from Haydn, Haydn learned from Bach, Beethoven learned from Mozart, but they certainly charted their own territory. They weren't just imitators.
In much the same way that very uh, remarkable science and scientists do the same.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's well, those are beautiful words to wrap up. Anything else you would want to share with us about your
Yeah, there's
work
just one
or
thing
yeah.
I think it is very relevant. I've never been politically interested, but just in terms of the some of the characters who dominate our world, again, there is an old saying that not one fruit on the tree turns rotten without the silent approval and knowledge of the whole tree. So, in one sense, there's no good complaining that we have totalitarian dictators and we have someone who tells lies all the time. The tree in this analogy is the country. We have approved of this individual, or large numbers of people have. So there's no good complaining. You knew what was happening. The tree knew that going on this way, there will be a rotten fruit. So rotten fruit don't just drop out of thin air, they grow on trees, and the tree approves of it. The nation has given its silent approval to some of the characters we would prefer not to have tea with. So you're given the approval, sort it out. So what I'm alluding to here is collective karma. We are all part of this. And to the extent that we approve of lies and deception and cruelty, we will get the individual who will enact what we approve of. Isn't that logical?
It is horribly logical, and I think maybe
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's the
yeah.
that's the some of the challenge of that inner journey
Mm.
to try to face, well, what is it among us that has kind of allowed these things to happen, and not necessarily assume that you didn't have a role in it, or at
Mm.
least sort it out to see how you can be part of. I think we also talked about the oft-used Gandhi quote, right? To
Yes,
be the
yes, to be the
change.
change. Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Dina, something else you wanted to offer?
Yes, I want to ask one more question following what was just said, which is I'm struck by the meanness of the leadership, and I'm just like, and I did not approve of it at all. Um, but if people are about efficiency and they're going to cut waste,
Mm.
there's ways that you can do that, and you certainly don't
Sure.
have a jackhammer, photo op over
You don't
people's
have a
lives.
picture of a chainsaw
Exactly. That's what I was
sliding.
trying
Yeah.
to say, chainsaw. And also there needs to be, you're talking about nature,
Mm.
and everything is interdependent on everything else. So,
As
you know,
science has shown so beautifully.
so if
Mm.
people lose jobs, they're no longer consuming the economy. There's all these things. So I have no problem with efficiency. But there's a me people are opening their eyes that didn't quite realize. But is there anything in the perennial wisdom or history that, like, I'm hoping it's the last gasp, this meanness, that it means that there is something coming on the other side. And what you just said about collective karma, I'm reminded of that etching on I think it was a wall like in Auschwitz, where I turned my head when they came for all these other people, and then there was nobody left to turn their head when they came for me. So maybe we're learning that, once again, we're not learning through joy, but through pain, that we're all interconnected. I don't know. But is there anything that would point to that maybe this will be coming to an end?
Well, all cycles, it's in the very nature of cycles to come to an end and to go through an upturn. But you use the very polite term meanness. I mean, I would, if I may say so, utter ruthlessness and callousness. Um, of course, efficiency is important. And again, we see this in nature. The body gets rid of dead cells. Nature has her waste recycling facilities, so to speak. So efficiency is part of nature's process, but done with such callousness and such glee is despicable. And also, it's so suddenly, without any prior warning, without consideration of the knock-on effect of families and society. One can do it more gently.
Definitely more strategically too, like
Well, strategically,
yeah,
yes, absolutely, yeah, yeah,
make you feel it was thought
yeah,
out.
yeah.
It doesn't in that way. Thank
But
you.
it seems to be an ideological warhead that's been blasted. It's more of an ideology than a well thought out strategy.
But the wisdom
And
does speak to our evolution back to source.
Mm,
I mean, I think that's one of the main tenets, if I
mm,
understand.
mm,
And
mm.
so to maybe provide some open balance to Dina's question, that yes, there this is part of a cycle, as you're saying, and there it will not always be this way. And many people
No.
I have heard talk about this idea of this is a time when things that have actually existed in some respects for hundreds, if not thousands of years in humanity, they're being flushed to the surface,
Being
and
flushed
they
to the
have been.
surface. And all those hundreds of years ago, the Vishnu Purana, the great Puranas of India, in the Vishnu Purana, you have a statement to the effect that during this phase of the Kali Yuga, Earth will only be venerated for its mineral resources, and women will only be good enough for their pleasure-giving propensities. I'm modernizing the Sanskrit, of course. So all those hundreds of years ago, the great sages had the vision of the way the cycle was going.
Right, right. And lots of discussions about, changing
Yeah,
periods and
yeah,
cycles so that that this is
yeah.
part of what we're
Mm,
in this time we live, which
mm,
is
mm,
certainly daunting at times, but also
mm.
just fascinating and inspiring if we can find that quietness we talked about earlier and go inside.
Yeah.
But to clarify, the
You
Kali
know,
Yuga is coming to an end, or is that not
oh,
our time?
no. Well,
Not
it's
yet.
it's a large cycle, and don't forget there are cycles within cycles. So there isn't a cut-off point, so to speak, but I would not say, certainly not in my lifetime, the Kali Yuga will come to an end. Far from it. And not according to all the wisdom books that I have read. But on a more uplifting note, I was just reading um, the sayings and a book on the great Florence Nightingale. What a wonderful woman. And and this is the point I'm making, that she was as great a scientist as a spiritual person. How many people know that Florence Nightingale was a great statistician, and she was able to see in statistics patterns and qualities way, way ahead of her time. She was a great scientist as well. And she said, and here is a woman who, for goodness sake, in the Crimean War saw enough blood, tears, and suffering. This wasn't just theory, this was experience. She said the two things people long for most are fresh air and light, but not just ordinary light, sunlight, prana. But then she said that there are three truths that she intuited for herself. That firstly, the universe is run by scientific laws framed by a higher intelligence. So the physical universe is run by scientific laws, but there's a higher intelligence behind it. That each human being has a spiritual core, and each human being will ultimately realize that spirituality and unite with the source. But here again is the great scientist. She said she was deeply Christian and universal, of course, in her aspect. There's no point in praying for miracles. You know, in those days, there was typhoid and dysentery in London. You clean up the sewers that pour their rubbish into the River Thames. Clean up the sewers. Don't pray for miracles. God helps those who help themselves. When you've done everything yourself, then you can pray for miracles. So, highly practical, deeply spiritual, totally scientific. And these are the people we should admire. A gentleman called Leopold Summers, who has heard of him, well, only because his wife, Alice Summers, was a great concert pianist in Nazi Germany, of course. And to cut a long story short, that she, Alice, Leopold, and their little boy were taken to the Terezin concentration camp or holding camp. And in there weren't gas chambers. So the way they pin down the numbers is you got to go and stand in the freezing rain all night. and by sort of natural selection, they thin the numbers down. So one day, a tall SS officer approached her. Now, she had been given concerts in this ghetto camp, and she'd been playing the Chopin etudes. And this tall SS officer approached her and said, don't be afraid. My mother was head of a conservatory. Just think of that, an SS officer, mother head of a music conservatory. But you will not be on the deportation list, nor will your little boy. But here's the point of the story. When she was parted from her husband, he was on the list to Auschwitz. He said, I want you to teach our little boy never to hate. Now, here is a man of character. These are the people. We hardly heard of them. These are the people we should respect, not the idiot who raises his hands and says, I'm going to chop 100,000 jobs off, I want you to teach our little boy not to hate. He knew the root cause of our problems. And Alice Summers lived to about 110 and lived in London. And she said, I was born a Jew, but my religion is Beethoven.
Beautiful. And you said this was Theresienstadt that she was in?
Stuff, yes.
Yeah. I lost a great grandmother there. So yeah, another family.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If I
No, but
touched
it's no, it didn't touch a nerve. It's just it's never forget, and it was real, and yet some great wisdom came out of those things.
Yeah.
So it's
Chopin's music has saved the lives of at least four great concert pianists in those circumstances. That's what Chopin does.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
That's what great music does, I should say. That's what great music does.
I just want to remind us that, people say, or various philosophies say we chose to be here at this time. If that would be true, then we're here to be acupuncture points of light.
Beautifully put. We chose, well, you would honestly say, I mean, how would some people choose what they've been given? But choice in the sense that the forces that have brought us into incarnation were, in the widest sense, the forces which we engaged with at some time, but we are also part of the society and the family we are born into. And we are indeed here to be cells on the body of humanity. And as you rightly, I love that, acupuncture points of light.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Thank you. But I love what you said too about we should be upholding different role models. I just love that.
Yeah. Uphold the role model of someone who's worked through suffering to enlightenment, someone who has something noble to say, someone who has shown the wisdom in the stupidity of what goes around us.
Yeah. And along the lines of what CJ is saying too is that we have in some schools of thought and information, if we have had as souls a deliberate choice to be here incarnated at this time, now strikes me as the time that we've been doing all this work and practice and to be able to do the things that we've talked about so much tonight, so that we can be that effective healing point of light.
It is a school of learning in a big way.
Yeah. So I often end these programs feeling just so grateful and in some ways overwhelmed with the opportunity to have the experience. This is certainly one of those such experiences, and I'm just delighted to have had the chance to meet. Hope we stay in touch. Perhaps when the next version is out, we can come back and revisit this more, because I think not only is it it's a beautiful experience, but I think it's fulfilling greater and greater need.
I've been delighted and very honored. If you want to pick on specifics or explore more general things or anything, I'd be very honored. Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, we are too, and I think it's as you said in your email, and I mentioned at the beginning, this comrade in arms on the spiritual path, and I think that's something else that we should all take some strength and hope from, is that we're not alone, and I think there
No,
are in
no. And
tremendous
on that
numbers.
note, I was listening to a program on Rachmaninoff's depression and how his psychiatrist got him out of it. And, many points. One is the fear of failure, but also when you're very successful, it creates another realm of panic and depression. But the main point is there is hope. They are friends. You are not alone.
Mhm. Right.
Mhm.
That's what got
So
Rachmaninoff through and many others.
thank you for this friendship and all those who joined us live, and those that see this in its recorded version. You are a welcome part of this group too, and so really, it's a
Thank you
wonderful
very much,
experience.
Ken.
We're very
We're very
grateful.
honored and all the very best.
Right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Eddie. We'll be in touch,
Thank
I
you
hope.
very much. All the best. Bye.